And here I am with my review of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. This will probably be a short review because there's really not a lot to say about this book other than it was really great, it was really funny, I recommend it. And this book was really funny. But the thing with a funny book is that you can kill it by talking too much about it, and that's what I'm worried about here. If I were to go over all the parts of the book that made me chuckle, I would kill the enjoyment for anyone who was going to pick it up again. So I'm going to do my best just to talk about it in general terms and just recommend you go out and read it yourself. I'm actually assuming, for the purposes of this review, I'm assuming that most people are like me. They read it or had it read to them in childhood and haven't picked it up again for years. That was my situation, as I explained in the video I made when I started this book, which I'll link to down below. I had vague memories of it from elementary school. I remembered, and I had also seen the movies. I had seen the 1971 movie. I haven't seen that in its entirety for years, but I had seen it back in fourth grade, and I saw the Johnny Depp movie in 2005 when it first came out, and haven't seen it since. So vaguely remember the movies, and of course have vague memories of the general plot from my childhood. And what I remember from the general plot is Roald Dahl's kind of dark humor, where there are four bratty children and they all get ironic fates doled out to them before the end of the book. And that, I suspect, is what most people remember. But what I had completely forgotten about is just all the gags along the way, all the little side stories. There's so many side stories about Willy Wonka. Chapter 3, for example, is Willy Wonka and the Indian Prince. It's a little side story about this prince in India who wants Willy Wonka to build him a chocolate factory. Or there's Willy Wonka in another chapter, chapter 16, describes how he finds the Oompa Loompas in Loompa Land, and it's just such a ridiculous story about finding the Oompa Loompas. I don't want to spoil it. To say too much is going to spoil it. But all throughout, there are these little side stories about Willy Wonka and his various side adventures that are just so imaginative and so ridiculous. And it's these kind of details that I've completely forgotten over the years. I mean, everyone remembers, the boy who gets stuck in the chocolate pipes, or the girl who turns into a blueberry from chewing the wrong kind of gum. Those are the things that everyone remembers, but there's just so many other funny little details throughout this book. And the dialogue as well, between Willy Wonka and the parents, or between Willy Wonka and the children, I thought was really funny. So I think maybe I appreciate the humor of this book more as an adult than I did as a child, because I think children tend to have more of a logical brain, perhaps. They don't appreciate absurdist humor or the bizarre humor. I don't know. It's difficult, of course, for me to, first grade was such a long time ago. It's difficult for me to accurately put myself back in the mind of a first grader. But I do remember from childhood there was always sort of a love-hate relationship with Roald Dahl's dark humor. I mean, on the one hand, the kind of tragic, ironic fates of these four children was part of the fascination of it, the fascination that children have with an element of horror or an element of something being scary. On the other hand, I as a child, I felt bad for these four other kids. As an adult, though, I'm able to detach myself from that completely. I don't. I don't know. I when I was a child, I tended to get more emotionally involved in the stories I read or were read to me, which prevented me somewhat from appreciating dark humor like Roald Dahl, even though there was definitely a fascination with all that, as I mentioned before. As an adult, though, I'm able to completely detach myself from it. So the dark humor I appreciate a lot more, and the absurdity and the bizarreness of everything I appreciate more. So I think this book hits my funny bone better as an adult, and I just had so much fun with it. The one thing maybe that does work better as a child is the book is always talking about how wonderful Willy Wonka's chocolates are, and talking about how creamy and sweet and frothy and gooey they are, and talking about the experience of savoring a piece of chocolate. And that's definitely something I remember as a child hearing this book when the teacher read it out to us, and just being able to imagine all that delicious chocolate. As an adult, I still have a sweet tooth, actually. I still eat way too much sweets. I've got a sweet tooth that is carried over with me from childhood. But to a large extent, the romanticization, if that's a word, of sweets is largely gone. So I can read this book and I think, well, the chocolate wasn't that tasty, now was it? Or I can think to myself, okay, it's wonderful to be in this big chocolate lake, and the first drink of that chocolate is going to be wonderful. But the second drink is not going to be quite as good, and by the third drink, you're going to be feeling a little sick. As an adult, the idea of being in this big chocolate paradise is not quite as appealing as it was as a kid, because as an adult you imagine getting sick quickly from all that sweets or feeling nauseous. So that part is something that maybe works better as a child. The imagination of how wonderful all this rich creamy chocolate would be all around you. But yeah, the humor I think I appreciate more as an adult. There is, yeah, maybe another interesting thing here. You'll remember from this book or from the movie, there's a character of Mike TV, character who just watches TV all day long. He's always got these guns around him because he watches too many gangster shows and westerns, and just doesn't want to do anything except watch TV. Which I thought was interesting because, nowadays there's such a moral panic about kids and screen time. And it's easy to forget that this panic did not start with iPads or smartphones or something like that. The panic apparently goes back all the way to the early days of television. This book came out in 1964, and authors like Roald Dahl were already thinking that kids spent too much time in front of the TV. And maybe kids did spend too much time in front of the TV in 1964. Sometimes I will romanticize the past and say, in the 50s and 60s, that was when people still had real lives and they went outside and they played, and it was before television took over everything. But sometimes you read, there was one other book I read, and this is a completely different genre, but Rabbit Redux, which is also written, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s, but it's about the late 60s, by John Updike, which depicts the characters just sitting around watching daytime television all day long in their apartment. So the idea that people were captives to their screen tends to go back as far as the invention of television, I guess. And then, if you remember from the story, Mike TV gets his ironic comeuppance when he tries to go inside the TV, and then all the Oompa Loompas give him their song. And they... Sorry, I know you can't read this, but there's an Oompa Loompa song which goes with every kid who meets a tragic fate. And they sing about how awful television is and how you should never let kids near it. And how much better it is for kids to read because reading really fires up your imagination. To which I have mixed feelings. I don't want to get sidetracked too much by this because the debate about kids and screen time and how harmful it is exactly, or how is it harmful, this is a debate which obviously goes all the way back to 1964, if not before, and there are all sorts of opinions on it. I could easily spend the whole video just talking about this. But briefly, it strikes me as somebody who's talked on this very channel about a television addiction and how I myself watch way too much TV. It strikes me that there is at least a feeling that television is dulling your brain. So, when I go and read for a couple hours, I come away from that feeling, not feeling tired. I mean, maybe, feeling a little bit tired because you've been sitting too long reading, but you don't feel intellectually drained. You feel intellectually recharged. Whereas if I watch TV for a couple hours, and I think we all know this feeling, right? When you spend a couple hours watching TV and then you're like, okay, I've got to turn off the TV and do something else with my day. And then you turn it off and you just feel so sluggish because you've been watching TV and well, I don't know. There's something about watching TV which makes you feel sluggish. And you can definitely see it in kids. Anyone who's been around kids watching TV, the way they completely just zone out and are motionless and fascinated by that TV for the duration of the time that it's on. So there definitely seems to be a sense in which it's dulling your brain. But whether or not that has any long-term effect on your overall intelligence, or whether it's just a temporary effect, I don't really know. I suspect there are probably studies out there somewhere, although when you're talking about the long-term effects, I imagine it's quite difficult to control for variables on a mass study. But then the second argument the Oompa Loompas make in this song is that television does not have anywhere near the imagination of books. So they talk about all the wonderful things that are in books. Dragons, gypsies, queens and whales, treasure islands, isles, distant shores, where smugglers rode with muffled oars, and pirates wear purple pants, and sailing ships and elephants, and cannibals crouching round the pot, stirring away at something hot. And I thought, well, there's no reason why that can't be in TV as well. You can have a TV show about pirates. I mean, I don't know. I think in 1964, television probably was a lot more limited than it is right now. We're living in the golden age of TV content right now, or so people say. I also think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in 1964, television was purely television. I mean, nowadays, when you turn on HBO, or even when you turn on normal TV, they'll be showing a movie on your television screen. I think that was much more limited in the early 60s, right? The television showed television content. If you wanted to see a movie, you had to go to the movie theaters. I think even movies which were relatively old by that time got re-released into theaters instead of being shown on television in the early 60s. Correct me if I'm getting that wrong. But that would mean that the pirate movies like Treasure Island or something like that would not have been accessible on the TV screen. So the TV screen would have just been, the boring made-for-TV content. But it's interesting. I was kind of thinking to myself, Roald Dahl has this reputation for being a real subversive humorist. But there's an element of social conservatism that seems to be running through these books. I mean, he talks about bratty, spoiled children and how they get their comeuppance, and then there seems to be a moral panic about TV and how it's robbing children of their imaginations. Um, but if you go to Wikipedia and you look at his bio, Roald Dahl was actually involved in a lot of television projects. He was writing for television. He appeared on television. So it makes you wonder how serious this whole moralizing against TV is, and how much of it is just an excuse for a stereotypical character. He's got to come up with all these kind of one-dimensional characters who have a quirk, and a kid who was obsessed with the TV was just like a cheap gag rather than a serious moral concern. I don't know. Yeah, what else do I want to say about this book? Again, I don't want to talk about it too much because there are all sorts of funny parts that I don't want to spoil. I just recommend you go to your library or go to your bookstore, pick it up. It's funnier than you remember, probably, if you haven't read it since childhood. I should talk about how long it is. This book here, actually, the last few pages are chapters, a preview of Charlie and the Glass Elevator, the Great Glass Elevator, the sequel book. So the bulk of the content of this book is only 180 pages. I read it in a day and a half. I know I'm a little late coming in with the actual review here. I could easily have read it in a day. So, I guess the good news is it's not a big reading commitment. Although if you're spending money on this book, I guess the bad news is it's only going to entertain you for a short period of time because it's so short. But if you get it out of the library, it's just such a short and painless read. According to Wikipedia, there was a controversy about the Oompa Loompas. I think in the original draft of this book, they were written as black pygmies from Africa, and people complained about that. And again, according to Wikipedia, Roald Dahl, to his credit, was sensitive about the complaints and rewrote them so that they're no longer depicted as black, and they're not in Africa anymore. They're in Oompa Land. Although he still got accused of racism, there was a back and forth between him and another author in the 70s, where she accused the Oompa Loompas as being racist stereotypes, and he defended himself. And you can read the whole back and forth on the internet. I'll try and remember to post a link to that down below. I don't actually have any strong feelings on this. I mean, I can kind of see where you could make that accusation. I don't think you have to make that accusation. I think you could just enjoy this without seeking racial overtones in it. To a certain extent, I'm reluctant to get into the controversy because I'm reluctant to say the wrong thing. But I don't have a strong opinion, and I completely enjoyed the book without even thinking about that until I read it on Wikipedia. Talk about the movie, huh? Like I said, I don't really remember the movies well, but I do remember certain parts of the movies. And one part of the 1971 movie that I do remember well is how Charlie and his grandpa break the rules a little bit and drink some of the fizzy lifting drinks, which causes them to lift up, and then they almost get cut up by the ceiling fan, but then they burp at the right moment. And that causes a crisis later in the movie where Willy Wonka accuses Charlie and his grandfather of breaking the rules, just like the other children. So Charlie is not the perfect kid. He and his grandfather have made mistakes, just like the other kids. That whole thing is not in the book at all, which I had forgotten that wasn't in the book. In the book, Charlie and his grandfather never steal the fizzy lifting drink. They never have that confrontation with Willy Wonka. I can understand why they put it in the movie, because in the movie, I think you kind of need those beats. I think it's what is referred to as the second act low point in screenwriting terms. And it's also a character arc where Charlie has to learn from his mistakes or grows a little bit. But there is no room for any of that slow reflection in the book. It's just all complete nonstop zaniness with nobody learning anything. With the possible exception of the four children who maybe have learned to be better people after they meet their ironic fates. But if they do learn anything, it's all completely off screen, so to speak, or off the written page, because we don't get to see them reflecting. And just as well, that kind of stuff would slow down the book, and this is just complete zaniness, just complete fun. So I'm gonna stop there. I said this was gonna be a short review, and I still rambled on for 20 minutes. But yeah, the takeaway here is go ahead and check this book out. I know you read it in childhood, but give it a reread because it's funnier than you probably remember. At least that was my experience.